She had pictured her life full of good things. She married, they inherited a farm. She had a couple of boys that were the pride of her life. But so many things had happened these past few years. Began with the famine. It led to the sale of the farm. That's why they moved. Farming was tough even at the best of times, but with each successive season, hope also dried up. On a clear day in the hills of Bethlehem, when you look east, you can see the fields of Moab. And over in Moab, it looked like things were going pretty well. Perhaps moving to Moab would be a fresh start. Perhaps things on the other side of the hill would just be greener and brighter. When they left Bethlehem, Naomi was married with 2 boys. Just a short time later, just after arriving in Moab, her husband died. There's some irony in the name of her husband is Elimelech. It means my God is king. We could forgive Naomi for being a bit cynical about that, because if God is king, he doesn't appear to be running his universe all that well right now. 10 more years. It's amazing how time flies. Both her boys get married. It's interesting when the text talks about her sons, it uses the term often translated kids or babies. And even though they're adults now, they're still her babies. She loved them dearly. But then just like that, just one after another died. Now her husband has gone, her boys are gone, she's got nothing. You have to realize life in the ancient world was not kind to widows. There was no insurance policies, there's no government pension. And as she retraced her steps back to Bethlehem, Naomi was this broken, empty woman. I mean, what does she have? Just a daughter-in-law, a foreign Moabite at that. Honestly, what did she really add to the balance sheet? This is how the book of Ruth begins. A famine and 3 funerals. It's a book in the First Testament, just a small little book of 4 chapters, and I have to say it must be one of the most depressing beginnings of any book that I have ever read. To me, it's this picture of utter hopelessness. You know, in preparation for this series, I've met with a few folks and asked them to describe the sense of hopelessness. And the words they used were words like darkness, loneliness, shame, trap, this sense of being overwhelmed with fear and anxiety. The word cynicism was used. And I asked them to unpack what that looked like in their own hopeless situations or in the friends or family members that they had. And one of them spoke of the broken dreams that just hadn't been eventuated. Perhaps because of time escaping them or some situation that happened in life. Another spoke of the shame of moral failing. It feels like, everything is just over. There is nothing to look forward to anymore. Or that feeling you have when your teenager slams the door in your face and there's no desire to be with you. And at that point, you can't see any way forward in the relationship. It's that feeling when your baby is hooked up to an IV and there's absolutely nothing you can do but stand there and watch. It's a betrayal and shame you feel when your wife leaves that note on the counter and walks out the door and you know, at least at some level, that it's partially your fault. This is the hopelessness that Naomi experiences. And it can be common ground, can't it, for you and for me? So how does hopelessness express itself in Naomi's life? We come to the beginning of this chapter in Ruth chapter 1, and we read this in verse 6. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had blessed his people in Judah by giving them crops again, so Naomi and her daughters-in-law got ready to leave Moab to return to her homeland. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she set out from the place that she'd been living and took the road that would lead them back to Judah. So after all this heartache, massive heartache, Naomi decided it was time to go home to Judah. She had heard that God was blessing the people in Judah again with good crops. The drought had been broken, crops had begun to grow again. And the writer here attributes all of this to God's providence and goodness. Of course, it raises a question for us, doesn't it? God's able to control the weather. and send rain and provide bumper crops? Why didn't he prevent Naomi's husband and boys from dying? There's no answer in the text. At this stage, Naomi can't see a whole lot in front of her. She's blind to hope. She heads out of town on this road to Bethlehem along with her two daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. But before getting very far, she tries to discourage her daughters-in-law from continuing with her. She argues that there is no hope continuing with her. She has no prospect of getting remarried and having children. There's no prospect of a financial security with her. If they return with her, they're going to be in such a hopeless situation just like she is, completely destitute. And she makes this statement here in verse 13. Things are far more bitter for me than it is for you, because the Lord himself has raised a fist against me. See, Naomi's perspective is that God is working against her. One of her daughters-in-law named Orpah takes Naomi's advice. She turns around, does a 180, returns home. But Ruth refuses to leave. And so they set off together for Bethlehem. Bethlehem means the house of bread. This is the place that God is providing, a place of visiting his people once again. And we drop down to verse 19. So the two of them continued on their journey. And when they came to Bethlehem, the entire town was excited by their arrival. Is this really Naomi? The woman asked. Don't call me Naomi, she responded. Naomi means pleasant. Instead, call me Mara, which means bitter. For the Almighty has made life very bitter for me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me home empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has caused me to suffer and the Almighty has sent such tragedy upon me? So Naomi's arrival sends the town buzzing. Can this really be Naomi? And remember, a name in that culture was significant, so this is the pleasant one. Because when she left Bethlehem, she had been this vigorous woman in her prime, but 10 years down the track, she's much older, she's tired, she's worn out because of what she's gone through. It's kind of like when my kids see the wedding picture of Robin and myself, they ask us, is that really you, Mum and Dad? Naomi says, don't call me Naomi, the pleasant one, call me Mara, the bitter one. Life has been hard on me. In fact, she doesn't just say life, does she? She says, God has been hard on me. And she makes these various statements about the way God's treated her. She says here, the Almighty has made life very bitter for me. When God was in his kitchen making all the ingredients of my life, he was pretty heavy on the vinegar and pretty light on the honey. She unpacks it a bit further. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me home empty. I was once this pleasant person to be around. I was full, I was happy. But God tipped me over. He's poured me out. He's squeezed me dry down to the very last drop. I've got nothing. And it's God's fault. To which he concludes, the Lord has caused me to suffer. The Almighty has sent such tragedy upon me. She feels like she's kind of like some target to God's arrows, and God is her adversary. It's quite a perspective, isn't it? It's important to point out that Naomi, to her credit, never stopped believing in God. But because of what she's gone through, this tremendous suffering, her view of God is skewed. She sees herself leaving full, coming back empty, having gone out sweet but returning sour, that God is against her. And in her mind, 3 tombstones in Moab testify to that very reality. Hopelessness expresses itself in a whole range of ways in our lives, doesn't it? For Naomi here, it expresses itself in bitterness. Something happens within your soul in the heat of adversity. Spirits curdle, they become sour, they become cynical. The perspective becomes one of just utter hopelessness. When I spoke to others about how hopelessness is expressed in their lives, that they see it expressed in things like the loss of motivation. It's hard to get up in the morning. Just kind of stuck in that moment, and it just feels like there's this dark cloud over your life, but you just can't move on from it. Or the downer attitude that just sees problems everywhere you go. It's always the glass half empty or completely empty. There's nothing good that can happen. It can express itself in cynicism. That would be what I often experience when I've been in a hopeless state. I just become really cynical. That though I believe in God's power and presence and goodness, I kind of become cynical about what that looks like in this particular situation. Because there's just this like built up kind of scar tissue that we can have in our lives, and it can kind of try to help us avoid other hurts and frustrations we might experience, and our souls just get kind of numbed. And we miss out on that childlike faith that Jesus craves for us. It's like we're scared to hope again. See, some of you today find yourself in that very situation. There's a whole bunch going on in your life. You have a lot in common with Naomi. That's how the story begins. And as I said, it's probably the most depressing story I've ever read right at the beginning. But I want you to move from chapter 1 to chapter 4, the very end of the story, because it's a huge contrast to this miserable beginning. 3 chapters later, a very different picture emerges. A picture of a grandmother giggling with her precious baby grandson. Completely, radically different picture. Remember Ruth, the Moabitess who traveled back to Bethlehem with Naomi? Well, she comes back, and along the way she's met a guy called Boaz, and he loves God and has compassion on the family, and one thing leads to another, and they get married. And this is what we read in the very last chapter. So Boaz took Ruth into his home, and she became his wife. And when he slept with her, the Lord enabled her to become pregnant, and she gave birth to a son. The woman of the town said to Naomi, "Praise the Lord, who has now provided a redeemer for your family. May this child be famous in Israel. May he restore your youth and care for you in your old age. For he is the son of your daughter-in-law who loves you and has been better to you than 7 sons." Naomi took the baby and cuddled him to her breast, and she cared for him as if he were her own. The neighbor woman said, "Now at last Naomi has a son again," and they named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse and the grandfather of David. What a great ending. From a picture of a famine and 3 funerals to a bassinet and a baby boy. Naomi went to empty to full once again. And literally here at the end of the story, her lap is filled with a grandson, and she's sitting there giggling away as she thinks about the life ahead. She's morphed from the bitter one back to the pleasant one. What a hope-filled ending to a hopeless beginning in the story. And the question I want to explore together is how do we go from here to here? How do we move from this, bitter, empty woman and the situation she's in to somebody full and pleasant and hopeful again? And in fact, every week we're going to be looking at that question. How is it that God moves us from here to here? Because if I ask you that question, obviously you can give kind of that answer we've learned from Sunday school that, God helps us move from here to here. But in this series, it's kind of like a study of hope. How does God move us from hopelessness to hope again? Sometimes in our series together, we're going to look at stories where God seems to do something immediate and something powerful and something now, and we move from here to there almost like in an instant. In this story, though, we learned that it actually took quite some time, over a process of time. And we also learned something else. We learned that God is using particular things. You see, we know God is involved, and that might be a bit of a surprise because God is just seen as the one intervening just twice in the story. In chapter 1, we see that God is the one providing the Israelites in Bethlehem with food. At the end of the story in chapter 4, we read that it's the Lord who enabled Ruth to become pregnant. And so you might sit back and go, well, we don't see God a whole lot in this story. But for the ancient readers of the story, this Hebrew community, whenever they read something at the beginning and end of the story, they kind of see it framing the whole story. And in other words, it's a way of saying God is involved in all of this. And so we need to sit back and say, well, how did he take Naomi from hopelessness to hope? And again, we learned that it was through a process, and we also learned that it was through some very ordinary people. People in Naomi's life by the name of Ruth and Boaz. And it was through the way that Ruth and Boaz made decisions, the way they lived, that these ordinary people making extraordinary choices were actually agents of hope in somebody's situation. So let's kind of unpack this a bit. First, let's put the spotlight on Ruth. You see, Ruth was not a person that you would ever expect to be an agent of hope in somebody's life. She was a Moabitess. Tom Golding, one of my Bible college professors, says that the whole book is kind of raising the question, well, who is Ruth, and providing an answer to that throughout the book, because throughout she's characterized as this Moabite woman. See a whole lot of references up there. She's always referred to in this way. It would be like somebody always saying, well, there's Jonathan the Kiwi. There's Jonathan the Kiwi. There's Jonathan the Kiwi. You kind of get an idea that there's a stress coming on this point that somebody's trying to make. And the writer here is certainly trying to make a statement. You see, back in Deuteronomy, the law of Moses specifically said that Moabites can never enter the congregation of Israel. And the reason for that was that the Moabites had mistreated Israel when they came up out of Egypt. So think about it, Ruth is the most unlikely person that could ever be an agent of hope to an Israelite person. We first meet Ruth when she's on the road to Bethlehem with Naomi. She's with, her mother-in-law and her sister-in-law, Orpah. And in terms of storytelling, Orpah's role in the story is really just to contrast the amazing decision that Ruth makes. As I said before, Naomi tries to discourage her daughters-in-law from journeying with her. And so, Orpah hears her advice. She does a U-turn. She hears the logic of the argument, heads back to Moab. She chooses the sensible, conventional track. Ruth, though, says this. Listen to these amazing words. Ruth clung tightly to Naomi. Look, Naomi said to her, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. You should do the same. But Ruth replied, don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die. And there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us. When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said nothing more. So Ruth chooses to return with Naomi to her homeland, to her family of origin. She moves away from the old ways of worshiping God to follow Naomi. Ruth is convinced of the truth of Israel's God, and she's committed to being with her mother-in-law, even if that means that she will never find a new husband, that she will remain impoverished for the rest of her life. Ruth has placed her trust in the God of Israel. It says a lot about the kind of person that she is. See, Orpah was good. She made the, normal common choice, decision. The passage doesn't portray her negatively, but Ruth made the uncommon decision to do something different, to do something to see hope where there wasn't any hope to be seen. Did Naomi realize or appreciate that about her daughter-in-law? No, at least not at the beginning. In fact, remember what she says when she returns to Bethlehem and the women see her. Remember what she says? She says, the Lord has brought me back empty. And yet here's Ruth standing right beside her. It's as if Ruth never uttered these words at all. Because the truth is, Naomi is not actually empty. She has one very underappreciated asset living right in her home. And though Naomi is oblivious to Ruth's decision, her decision is noticed by a man named Boaz. As if one day she, just by luck, encounters Boaz, this wealthy landowner, and they have this conversation. And Boaz notices he's kind of heard something about the amazing decision that Ruth has made earlier. He says, I also know about everything you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I've heard how you left your father and mother and your own land to live here among complete strangers. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you've done. Now, if you know your Old Testament really well, you might kind of pick up on some of the words that he's used there, because it's kind of paralleling another situation that Abraham once encountered. God had once said to Abraham back in Genesis, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. And there's kind of all these like verbal cues between the two stories with father and land and relatives and homeland and go. Because Boaz is recognizing something about Ruth, that she's like a child of Abraham. She's left her old way of life just like Abraham did, and she's embraced this new God as her God. And she's made some enormous sacrifices along the way. So she's not really a Moabitess any longer. She's like a true child of God. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. It's through these decisions that Ruth made that God enabled her to be an agent of hope to bitter Naomi, moving her from Mara, bitter, to pleasant Naomi. Well, let's put the spotlight on Boaz, the other person God uses to bring hope. Boaz is a farmer, property developer. His character and the choices he makes are also put on display. And one of the ways that I enjoy this is in verse 2 of chapter 4, which I find really interesting. While Ruth was there, we read, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The harvesters are his employees. The Lord be with you, he said. The Lord bless you, the harvesters replied. Now that might not seem all that earth-shattering to you, might seem a bit quirky and weird, but the setting of Ruth is really interesting. See, the opening line of the book of Ruth says, in the days when the judges ruled. This is the setting. And when you turn to the book of Judges, you find that Judges were set in a time when Israel had no king. Everybody did that which is right in their own eyes. That's the last verse of the book of Judges. The majority of people in Israel are living without God, just doing whatever they wanted to do. Some would say the culture of our day is very similar. And yet here, right in Bethlehem, is a man who's doing something the majority is not doing. Here he is following after God. He's blessing his workers in the name of the Lord, and they think enough of him to bless him back in the name of the Lord. I mean, that's really impressive. And then this poor widow from a despised foreign land shows up, gleaning in his field, and rather than do what other people might have done and kind of push her aside, he treats her with exceptional kindness. And there's a lot of his actions that might be kind of small in and of themselves. The spotlight's put on them in chapter 2. We see this. He advises Ruth to stay in his fields, to stick close to his female workers. He commands his servants not to harm her. He gives her permission to drink from the water his servants are also drinking from. He asks the Lord to bless her. He shares his food with her. He instructs the harvesters not to harass her. He instructs them to kind of intentionally drop barley on the ground. It's kind of a way of giving her dignity and helping her along the way. See, the picture we have of Boaz is of a man following after God. Not only does he just allow her to glean in his fields, which is what the Lord told him to do, but beyond that, he's extending this great kindness and compassion to Ruth. And it's not, at least at this stage, because he's interested in her romantically, but because he recognizes something about her and her exceptional character. See, the picture we have is pretty Boaz. He's an exceptional guy as well. Both Ruth and Boaz are these ordinary people, though, who've made these exceptional life decisions. They're not doing what's right in their own eyes, they're doing what's right in God's eyes. And I think it's really important to grasp that this is the way God moves people from here to here. It's through people like Ruth and Boaz. Again, in this story, what we see is hope is not experienced immediately. It comes over a period of time. And the way God brings that about is primarily through two people, Ruth and Boaz. Through the extraordinary choices of these two very ordinary people, we're able to move this bitter old woman to this giggling old grandmother. And little did they know at the time, but their actions would bring hope not just to Naomi, but to a whole nation of Israel. Remember, their son Obed was the grandfather to King David. So at this time when Israel had no king and everybody did that which was right in their own eyes, these two ordinary people who made these extraordinary choices actually brought hope to an entire nation as their son would, a few generations later, King David would come, the greatest king that Israel has experienced. And yet, there's something even more about the implications of their decision. Because along their line, there would be somebody else that would come that would bring hope not just to an entire nation, but to an entire world. Centuries after even this book was written, Jesus Christ would come from their line. Jesus who would bring eternal hope, renewing people and places everywhere. And Jesus comes from their line, from their son, ultimately from these decisions that Ruth and Boaz made. They had no idea of the implications that their choices would make. Some of these decisions were big decisions, leaving a country, leaving a God, leaving a whole bunch of circumstances. Some of them were day-to-day work choices about how to treat employees and people in the fringes of society. And yet this is what God uses to move people from hopelessness to hope. I'm hoping that provides you some encouragement and an invitation to step in to be an agent of hope in the lives of others around you. Remember, neither Ruth nor Boaz were church leaders. They're not pastors. Ruth is a foreign widow. She didn't even have a whole lot. Boaz is a farmer. But God used them to be part of this process to bring people from hopelessness to hope. And they had no idea of the implications of what they were doing. So I want you to see ordinary people who make extraordinary choices can be agents of hope in this world. The simple things you do at work, the simple things you do at school or university, at home, wherever you are, can be used by God to bring significant hope to people's lives. Earlier this week, I heard a couple of initiatives that a couple of our young adults in our church are doing, and wanted to share that because I think this captures it for me. Allie Anderson was doing a musical gig earlier this week, and she had invited a whole bunch of people to kind of do the musical gig, and people were coming, and she just, on her own decision, decided to kind of tweak it a bit just to raise awareness for a charity called Motorbike Book Club. It's a small traveling library in Vietnam promoting literacy to rural communities. And just that small decision she made enabled some fundraising to happen and some awareness to happen around this other charity. So that little decision she made is actually bringing hope to a community that she's never even met. And then I came across another one of our young adults, Huia, who took the initiative. You heard Will talk about it earlier. It's in your bulletin and on the website. Just this initiative of collecting, beanies and gloves and socks for needy people around Auckland, because she wants to connect with them and many homeless people and just provide physical and spiritual hope to people in this particular cold season. So you see those kind of reasonably small decisions that people are making, different initiatives. I'm really proud of our young adults and the way they're stepping out to be effectively agents of hope in the lives of others. And it's from the small book of Ruth, I learned that actions like this is what God uses to move people from hopelessness to hope again. Some of you just need that reminder and that invitation to be, God, I want to be an agent of hope in the people around me. But some of you today actually need an encouragement for your own souls, because you know full well what Naomi's experiencing. Remember, Naomi couldn't see what was right in front of her. All she realized about God was that he's actively present and powerful, but she didn't see him working for her good. She didn't realize any of that. She'd just become bitter and cynical. Her dreams were shattered. Again, she never stopped believing in God, but she developed this skewed idea of the way God works. And she had deduced from her circumstances that somehow God was against her, causing her harm, the death of her husband and the death of her boys. But the book of Ruth goes to great pains to show, no, God is good, and God is present, and God is working behind the scenes, especially for the vulnerable. As was seen, he did that through Ruth and Boaz right in front of her. And he did a whole lot of things through what could have been termed at the time just lucky coincidences. Either way, Ruth just happens to stumble into the fields where Boaz was. The words of the text are, and it chanced a chance, or it happened a happening. The writer deliberately kind of overdoes the stress so that we kind of lean in and go, I don't think this is coincidental. God is involved in this. And just when we're reflecting on those words, we read, just then Boaz arrived. It's like the idea of, wouldn't you know it? He's arrived, this great man, just when she's leaving. It's a way of saying this is a little too coincidental. And then you see it in how Ruth gets pregnant. There were 10 years of Moab. She never had a son, but now it just seems to happen really quickly. All this luck. And through all this luck, the writer's saying to us, look, see the hand of God as at work here. God is involved in the small events and the small decisions of ordinary people to replace bitterness with pleasantness, to bring fullness where there was once emptiness, to bring hope where there was only hopelessness in somebody's vantage point. So God might bring hope in a miraculous and an immediate way. We'll see that in some stories to come. Or he might do, as in this story, something over a longer period of time through very ordinary people and in very ordinary circumstances. But either way, he is powerful. Either way, he is present. Either way, he is good. Let me finish with a story that reminds me of this in my own life. It happened in the life of a guy named Jim at the Bible college that I studied at. It's one of those stories where you sit back and go, yay, God. Jim wrote a novel called Blind Sight. No publisher wanted it, so he published it electronically. A while later, disaster happened to a family that he had never met or known anything about. 2 young men broke into a home in Texas and shot the husband, killed his wife and 2 sons. Then they set fire to the house and left the family for dead. And though he had been shot 5 times, Terry, the husband, escaped through the bathroom window and crawled to his neighbor's house. And to make matters worse, his daughter was implicated in the crime. So overnight, Terry lost really his entire family. A few months later, Terry was back at the property. The remains of the house had been bulldozed and not a whole lot remained. And torn with grief, he asked why God would take his family and allow him to survive. He cried out, God, why would you take my family and not me too? And as he stood there, he noticed a piece of paper on a nearby tree. He went across to look at it, and the paper was part of this novel that this guy, Jim, from the Bible college I was at, had written. The edges were scorched, but it was really a message from God for Terry. This is what was written, the words of the novel. It was just 1 page from a 400-page novel about a man who had lost his wife and children in a car accident. And at this stage in the novel, the main character is praying, and this is what Terry found at the tree. This is all that remained of the book. I couldn't understand why you, God, would take my family and leave me behind to struggle without them. I guess I still don't understand all that completely, but I believe that you are sovereign, that you are in control. And I know that you brought me these friends into my life, that you could have taken my life, but you've spared it. You've gone on sparing it. It doesn't matter what happens to me now, God, but please use me. And in the book, Thomas closed the drapes and stood alone in the dark room for the first time in 2 years. He was at peace with God and himself. He knew what he had to do. And as Terry read those paragraphs, it just switched his life around and infused him with hope. And he started to travel around and share that story in a few churches. And he didn't know the book because this is the only page that had, only page that had remained of the entire book. But he started to share that story, and he came into a church where it just happened that the writer of the book, Jim, had once pastored this church, and his daughter was still there and was able to put all the pieces together. See, this one little page was preserved by God to bring hope to a needy soul. Through that little page was exposed to weather for weeks. That was only part of a 400-page novel. It was exactly the paragraph that this man needed to hear. God was saying something personal and amazing for this guy to infuse him with hope. See, tragedy caused Naomi to lose perspective. We see that she judged God way too quickly. But Naomi's life encourages us that things don't always turn out the way that we think they might. A bad beginning may actually have a good ending. And if you're in Naomi's shoes today, I want to invite you to trust God in the way that he can move you from hopelessness to hope again. I'd like to just give you a moment just to sit in quietness. And perhaps the Spirit of God is just wanting to speak to you today about what this story looks like in your own life story. What I find helpful as I reflect on that is I just like to put my hands out in kind of openness. There's nothing magical about that. It just helps me kind of have a sense of receiving from God what I need to receive from God today. And if you want to do that, you can just put your hands out. As you do that, I want you to think about maybe a few things here in the story. Perhaps you need to receive a sense from God about the invitation that you have to bring hope to other people at the moment. Maybe you're around people who are in a very hopeless state, at work, at home, in your neighborhood, and God is inviting you to be an agent of hope. What does that look like for you? Or perhaps today, you need to remember that God is good, and God is present, and God is powerful, and can move you from bitterness and from cynicism to hope again. Or perhaps it's time for you to actually take a step towards Jesus. You've been exploring and wondering for some time about what that looks like, and maybe today you can just say in the quietness of this moment, yes, Jesus. Like Ruth, I want to leave my old life and find my new identity as a child of God. Let's take this moment to talk to Jesus. But God, we together, in a whole range of circumstances in this room, want to declare and want to experience that you, God, are great and good and powerful and present. God, would you move us from hopelessness to hope again? And would you use us to be agents of hope to others? In Jesus' name, amen.